Hi everyone. Before we start this episode, we want to note that at the time of recording, our guest, Sophia Alexandra Hall, was Deputy Digital Editor at The Big Issue. She has since left, but continues to work with them as a freelance correspondent. Enjoy the episode. Hello everybody and welcome back to the John Schofield Trust podcast, a space for early career, aspiring and working journalists to get advice and insights into the industry. I'm your host, Bethany Lee, an early career journalist and 2024 Fellow of the Trust. Today we're joined by Sophia Alexandra Hall, who is a Deputy Digital Editor at The Big Issue. So hi, Sophia.
Thank you so much for having me. Hi, Bethany.
Of course. So we're going to be discussing sort of the importance of telling people's stories responsibly. And I want to jump right in because I feel like we've got a lot to cover. So you're a care experience journalist, but before you were a journalist, you were the subject of a story yourself, which you've spoken about openly. But for anybody who hasn't sort of heard about that before, what was that experience like and how did it kind of catalyse you going into the industry?
Yeah, for sure. I've actually been the subject of a couple of different stories. And when I speak to other people in the care experience community, for anyone who doesn't recognise that term, care experience is anyone who grew up in the care system. So whether it's foster care, residential, kinship, adoption, I was in foster care. I don't know anyone in that community who's like outspoken about the community they're from that hasn't been interviewed by a journalist. I think because apart from Tracy Beaker, growing up, there wasn't like a ton of representation for our community. So as I got older, journalists started approaching me as soon as I became more open with my experience. The biggest platform, I'd say for me before I became a journalist was I was doing my master's and there was a piece on care leavers going to university and succeeding. And there are all these kind of pieces out there sort of celebrating and saying how amazing these care experience people going to university. So I was interviewed for that and it was in The Guardian and I was like, this is so exciting. The Guardian, like sick. I grew up reading that newspaper. It was like the only newspaper I could understand. I wasn't really always wanted to be a journalist. So yeah, really excited when this journalist approached me. Fast forward to when the piece actually went out, which was a good few months later. And the header of the piece was this massive, like, zoomed in picture of my face. And I was like, whoa, that's a lot of my face. Like, that's more than enough face for me, let alone people who don't know me. And it was really interesting. The journalist was a really great guy and I have nothing bad to say about him. In reality, the piece was about 800 words. I spoke to this guy for over an hour. And so that was the first time I'd ever seen, me pouring my heart out to a journalist thinking like, we're really good mates. And then in reality, about 25 words is how like my story was summed up. And I remember feeling quite disappointed actually when I saw this piece for the first time, because I thought, wow, is that like the only interesting part of me? It was really weird to get my head around.
Yeah, it's like having somebody else's sort of interpretation of your life and you don't have a lot of control over it, which I think is kind of the scary thing. If you could sort of go back or redesign the story in a way, how do you wish that it had been handled differently? Is there anything
interesting? Maybe not handled differently, but maybe like a heads up that this might not be a dissertation length article into the depths of your life, but instead like, we're featuring two other people. Even though we might lead with your face, you might only have a few quotes in here. But if you'd like to take your story elsewhere and maybe tell it yourself, we can always link to you. Something I talk about a lot is some of the best stories, you don't just find them in the news, you also find them out there already being told by lived experience people on other platforms like social media, for example.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a bit of a problem in the industry because when you've worked in it for a while or when you're first starting out, you're so focused on sort of getting the news story and you just understand how it works. You understand how a news story works. And I think a lot of the time we lose sight of the fact that the people we're interviewing aren't in this world. They don't know what's going to come out of the other end. And
it's really easy to forget, especially as you say, when there's like a deadline coming up. But yeah, I think especially when you're interviewing someone about something so personal, you have to put yourself in their shoes. Like not only just, to ask empathetic questions, but also to think like, how would I feel if this story were about me? I think a couple of journal schools like do the example of how would I change this story if it was about my brother or my sister or my mum or something, which I think is a good example. But I think also just putting yourself in those shoes, it might give you a very different insight as to how you're telling a story.
Yeah. And how did you then decide that you wanted to pursue journalism?
It wasn't actually that made me decide to pursue journalism. It was, growing up, I saw foster kids, foster children, care leavers, all these different types of terminology from my community represented in the media. More often than not, those stories weren't being told by people from my community. There were so many stereotypes. I'd say like the statistic that radicalized me was there were always these headlines that said 6% of care leavers go to university. And for some of my friends, that really hyped them up, and they were like, yeah, we're going to be part of that 6%. We're going to beat the statistics, beat the odds. But then for me and other people, it was like, am I good enough to be in that top 6%? We later found out that due to, the ivory tower of academia, that stat wasn't even correct. That stat was out of date, and yet every major news publication was running with that headline, and some still do, which is so problematic. I think it was around then I realised that journalists are actually just human beings, which it sounds a bit stupid, but like when I was growing up, I guess you look at news presenters on the TV and you think these must be the smartest people to ever live. And I guess I just assumed they had access to all these things. But now, having been in the industry for a while, I don't always have, over paywalled access to new statistics, new academia, new research. And so, of course, we're going to get some stuff wrong. What actually sort of took me on the path to becoming a journalist was I was working in the music industry when COVID hit. I was put on rotational furlough. And so I had 3 weeks on, 3 weeks off. During my 3 weeks off, I noticed a statutory institute that came into government overnight called SI 445, essentially removing a lot of rights for children in care. I thought, this is crazy. Why is no one talking about it? And so I reached out to a charity that were taking the government to high court. And I said, I'll do anything for you. I'll help. I know nothing about the law. And I said, I'll go through Ofsted reports. I'll help you collect evidence. And while I was doing that, I was breaking down what was going on in an accessible format on Twitter to my followers, because I had a lot of followers within the care experience community. And while I was doing all of this, I just thought, do I want to be a lawyer? Is that what's going to happen? And I thought, you know what? Breaking down complex legal jargon and turning it into an accessible communication, that's journalism. And I applied to News Associates, and the rest is history.
What an amazing way into the industry. That's so interesting. And you've now gone on to do lots of different things, and obviously now you're at the big issue. You've also written a media toolkit for journalists and care experience people. So why was it important for you to create that resource?
Absolutely. So when I first became a journalist, I had a lot of my friends reaching out to me. As I mentioned, care experience people were often asked by journalists to speak to the media just because there's not a ton of representation of us in visible positions. And so I had lots of friends messaging me and saying, hey, Sophia, I've just done this article and I feel really bad. Or, hey, Sophia, this article's been published and I don't know where they've got this headline from, or they've used this image I didn't give them, all these kind of things. And I was, trying to reply as best as I could with advice to everyone. And I was getting these messages at least once a week, which is a crazy amount of messages. And I thought, you know what if I just produce a Word doc or something that I can share on Twitter? That way I don't have to answer all these DMs, not because I don't care about my friends, but it was just happening so often. So I did a small doc and published that on just my Twitter. And then I realized, I'd love to create some kind of guide that isn't just my opinion, but kind of has the backing of psychiatrists, people who specialize in trauma, people social workers, charity leaders, people who deal with these kind of comms all the time. And I was speaking to my good friend Jude Habib, who has just stepped down as CEO of Sound Delivery Media, which trains lived experience people to become media spokespeople. I was speaking to her and she said, you can't put all the onus on care experience people, Sophia. I think you should create a media toolkit / guide for care experience people, but also journalists themselves, because so often they don't realise that what they're doing could be triggering, could be re-traumatising, could be making someone's life really difficult when in reality they're just trying to do their job. And I was like, yeah, that's a really good idea. At that time, I was working at Classic FM on the news desk. I thought, I don't have time to do something like this. And I think I'd just gotten the John Schofield Trust Fellowship as well. I was like, I don't have time to do any of this. And I saw an application open for the Churchill Fellowship, and the Churchill Fellowship is amazing. I'm going to big it up. They give you a pot of money. They give a pot of money to about 100 people a year, and you can go anywhere in the world and research whatever you want, as long as it brings back positive change to the UK. And so I pitched the idea of a toolkit to the Churchill Fellowship, and after months of a really long application process, I got it. And I ended up travelling to Boston, New York and Los Angeles. And that's how I did over 50 interviews, which all informed this guidebook. And that's 50 interviews in the space of 30 days, which was, do not recommend.
Intense. Yeah, that sounds really intense. Have you had sort of like a good response from it?
Yeah, I have. It's been really nice, because I think sometimes, like, no matter what you're doing, even with like news stories, sometimes you create something and you think, is anyone gonna hear this as you put it out into the void? But no, I've had some great traction. A lot of news organisations have taken it up. I know the BBC use it. I know Channel 4 Newsroom uses it. And I have lots of care experience friends who now say to journalists they won't do a story until the journalist reads the toolkit. And what's been really nice as well is, even though I wrote the toolkit with care experience people in mind, it's now gotten to the point where people, who, are asylum seekers, have been in domestic, have experience of DV, CSA, all these different things, like vulnerable communities, they use it too, because a lot of the skills are very transferable. And I realised quite early on that the things affecting care experience people were also affecting others from underreported on communities.
Yeah, 100%. And all that sort of making sure that every story is trauma informed.
Absolutely.
For all different communities. You also recently did a TEDx talk on the topic, which was amazing, by the way. Everyone should go and watch it. Like, genuinely, I'm not even just saying that because you're here. And you spoke about underrepresented voices and how they often only get coverage if they fit 3 different narratives. So I was wondering if you could break that down for people, because I think they're really helpful to sort of acknowledge and understand why they're harmful.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Yeah, you can't see this, guys, but I'm like grinning. It was very sweet of you to say. So I call this my 3-box method. I should really get like a snazzier title for it, but as a journalist with lived experience, I've often noticed that stories from underreported on communities only get told if they fit into these 3 boxes. And I define this as the tragic victim, let down by governmental systems, surrounded by headlines filled with doom and gloom statistics they're unlikely to beat. Then there's the dangerous threat, the othering of a community, one person's story becoming, like a summary of an entire group of people. And then the inspirational exception, like my piece about, how I went to university as a care leaver. They did it. They beat the odds. They beat the statistics. But also that piece is then reinforcing the statistic and the stereotype by repeating it. The example I use in the TED talk is last summer, asylum seekers were kind of thrust into the media spotlight. Hundreds of thousands of stories and hours upon hours of rolling news footage. But, can you tell me what the weekly allowance of an asylum seeker is? Can you tell me how long a decision takes? And if you can't, you have to think, was I like watching the news? Is that the news that I was listening to? Was that meant to inform or inflame?
Yeah, I think that's such a good quote that I've said in TED Talk and I've said now. It's like a really key thing to get right, but obviously it's also very hard, I think, to get it right when you're dealing with newsroom constraints and all those things. Absolutely. As well. Deadlines are very real, word counts are very real, all of those things. What would your sort of main pieces of advice be to journalists on how to avoid sort of oversimplifying stories while still working within those constraints?
It's really, really tricky. And I think also what's really surprised me doing all this work is the amount of sort of senior editors who have come up to me and been like, well, what's the issue? Like, this is just the news. We are reporting on this. It's like, for example, I had a very senior editor come up to me and say, oh, I don't know why you've used, asylum seekers as a theme here. There's loads of positive stories in the news about immigrants. And I was like, okay, well, you've just named a completely different community. And are we simplifying stories so much that you don't know the difference between these 2 communities? In terms of the newsroom, like, there are different stories you tell, right? Sometimes it's quick turnaround. You're writing 600 words on something that's just happened, it's likely you're not going to be going into like the details of someone's life in a story like that. I think with all of these boxes I'm talking more about like the in-depth features. I'm talking about the ones where you really dive into someone's personal life and you try and, you know, bring out emotive quotes. I think it all stems back to, you know, how would you feel if the story was about you? And the one piece of advice I always give is, you know, try and centre a lived experience voice. And I don't just mean that in terms of taking their quotes. I mean, talk to them. Like if you're writing stories, if you were a journalist last summer and you were writing stories all the time about asylum seekers, do you have any asylum seekers in your life? Like, do you have any in your friend group? Like, have you spoken to one? Because the amount of journalists who are reporting day in, day out on communities they've never met it's like a majority. And that's wild. It's something I, you know, try and help people understand outside the journalism industry. I say, you know, sometimes I have 30 minutes to become an expert in a community. It's the reason I've started commissioning more. I try and prioritise commissioning more and more because sometimes I think, you know what, I don't know enough about this community and it shouldn't be my lens that's directing the story, it should be theirs. So even if you can't, you know, if you're not in a place to commission right now in your career, you can always go meet someone for coffee. You can talk to charities. You can set up those dialogues because the more you understand about a community, the better your story is going to be. And I don't just mean like, oh, it's going to be more trauma informed. I mean, you will find the better stories.
Yeah, 100%. No, I think that's a really good point. And when you are commissioning stories or writing them yourself, what questions, or are there any questions that you're kind of asking yourself to make sure that it is informing and not inflaming?
There's a something I say to the reporters at work. Never go into. I mean, they all do this anyway, so I hardly have to say it. But never go into an interview like thinking you know what the story is going to be. Some of the best pieces I think I've written or worked on have been things I've found out during the interview just from like a tiny thing they've mentioned halfway through, and that is so much about asking the right questions but also understanding that community. A quick example I'll give is last December, a girl on X posted about how she was given a waiting time of, I think it was like 17 years for an autism assessment. Obviously, like, a lot of journalists started swooping in and were like, this is a wild number, like, oh my gosh, how could this possibly happen? And I reached out to the person who happened to be care experienced, and she agreed to just talk to me because she wanted to talk to a journalist that was care experienced. So I was like, that's really kind, let's do this. So we got together in January and I spoke to her, and what I realised, there was a much deeper story here, maybe one that a quick turnaround journo wouldn't have found. And that was the reason she was on this list waiting 17 years is because she'd originally tried to go through a different route, but they hadn't accepted her because she couldn't provide childhood evidence. She couldn't provide childhood evidence because she'd been in foster care, and instead of finding a way around it, the organisation had just stopped replying. I published that article. Within 8 days, that organisation reached out and she was diagnosed.
Wow.
Instead of, I think it was 18 years actually, so instead of 18 years, it was 8 days.
Yeah. That's amazing. And it's like, it's that easy.
Yeah.
To just dig a little bit deeper. I think that journalism and advocacy are a lot closer than people realise, or maybe people are too scared to see them intersect. Do you think, or have you seen evidence in the work that you have done that there is room for this sort of slower and more considered journalism? Like, have you seen that audiences are receptive to that?
I mean, yeah, it's not just the audience. I feel like the communities we're telling the stories about are more receptive. I've had some really nice examples of where I've gone in cold to a community and maybe done like one piece, and that's been so well received. We then have an entryway into speaking to more of this community, and that's been amazing. And it's really nice building that trust. And I will say it doesn't always have to be slow. Like I've still, you know, turned around pieces and like I did the government announced a new child protection authority in December 2025. And I spoke to someone with experience of CSA and turned around that article in 1 hour. Like that's a really heavy topic. But I worked with him as collaboratively as I could, as someone who doesn't give out quotes, especially you don't have time within an hour turnaround, But I said to him while on the phone call, I said, what type of headline are you expecting to see? Or like I DM'd him the headline before it went out, because I know that a lot of people with lived experience can often be like triggered, maybe is the right word to use here, when sort of performative, emotive headlines are used about their experience. And so, with my trauma-informed cap on, I was able to go through that interview and pull out sort of the emotive quotes, but like the non-damaging quotes, I think is fair to say. And that just comes with experience. So I guess if you're talking about timing, the more slow stories you do, the faster you are going to get, so much so that the stories you are turning around within, half an hour, half a day, like you will just get quicker at doing that in a trauma-informed way.
I know that you said earlier, I was just thinking about it because earlier you said that obviously the media toolkit is mostly aimed at journalists because, the responsibility shouldn't be on care experienced people or other underrepresented communities to tell their stories in a certain way. But I also found it interesting that in the TED Talk you said about how if audiences see something in a story that they think isn't quite right or has maybe not been handled the best, they should reach out to the organisation rather than commenting about it online. And I think it's a really interesting point, so I'd love for you to kind of explain why you think that should be the way that it's done.
Yeah, for sure. I didn't used to think this way, but for the last 2.5 years I've edited the letters page at the Big Issue. So I see all the letters that come in and I'm sure some people don't think this is the case, but I read every single one. And I'm sure at most organisations, if you're writing a letter to the editor or to the publication, someone is going through all of those pieces of writing. And if I see something that says, oh, I think, you missed the mark with this piece, or I want to shout out this reporter, or I want to suggest this reporter reads this, if it's like a helpful comment, I will always pass on to the person who wrote that piece. And sometimes it really informs our journalism. We've had new stories because someone's pointed something out to us. As I've already said, journalists don't know everything. There's usually someone out there who knows something more than us, and sometimes that person is, within our audience. I think my comment about, not commenting underneath is, as someone who has worked in a newsroom that's, clicks obsessed, everything counts towards your engagement rate, and that includes comments. So even if you really hate this piece, by writing a comment, you are contributing not to the problem, but again, to someone's metrics. And I think also, I know when I was at journo school, there were a lot of people who said like, oh, don't read the comments. And I think as social media has got maybe more hateful and less moderated, lots more people aren't reading the comments. And so we are maybe missing out on great new stories or great ideas from our audience. So if you as a news consumer ever see something, I'd always recommend getting in touch with the organisation, because you never know, they might listen.
I want to switch a little bit and focus a little bit more on advice, because that's what this podcast is all about. What would your advice be to journalists?
I think, as we've suggested before, centre that voice. This story is not personal to you, but it's personal to your interviewee. I always feel I don't know about you, but I always feel really humbled when someone tells me their story. It feels like a real honour. This is something that they might not have told anyone else before. When I was researching for my toolkit, I went to the Dart Center in New York, which is amazing. The Dart Center is a school at Columbia, and it's like the leading place for trauma-informed journalism in the world. And I went to a panel, and it was full of, war correspondents, and they said, journalists are first responders. And I don't think I'd ever really seen journalists as that before. They said, they are often on the front lines, but they all often also hear stories for the first time, stories that have never been muttered. And I think going into interviews like that can really help place you in the right sort of emotive state or empathetic state to hear someone's story and know what to do with it. And again, just coming back to the whole, how would I feel if this was my story? You know, how would I want this to be told?
Yeah, I think it's like a really big responsibility, and it should be seen as one. For any early career journalists listening, what are some sort of more practical things that you think they should be doing or practicing in their journalism to ensure that it kind of leans more in the responsible and trauma-informed direction?
Sure. My sort of just blanket advice to early career journos is always just start. Like, I think that's definitely a mistake I made when I was at the start of my career and still in journo school. I was so scared to write that first article. I was so scared. And of course, like, once I wrote that first article, I was like, oh, this is easy. Like, I say that, I think it was like, you know, tips for like how to spend Valentine's Day. Like,
very important.
Yeah. It's super hard hitting. You need to be really trauma informed for that. Definitely start. You know, if you want to be writing stuff, just start writing, start pitching. If you want to be in broadcast and, you know, you don't have that experience, just start making TikToks. Start doing, like, filming yourself speaking, putting together B-roll, you know. I feel like in the newsroom, I'm definitely seen as a jack of all trades, but that has gotten me to, like, the position I'm in now, because I am someone who can just be, like, sent off to do a video on my own. I can come back with like an hour-long interview cut up in Premiere Pro, and that just came because I messed around on TikTok and whatever the apps were back in the 2010s. I can't think, but kind of iMovie style pieces together. But in terms of, for those of you sort of looking more at the trauma-informed, you know, how can I be really ethical? How can I be really mindful with my reporting? My advice is read. Like, find interviews with maybe like a journalist you really like and someone from an underreported on community. So yeah, whether that's, you know, asylum seekers, foster kids, you know, all these different types of communities. And also, like, look to, you know, your news nights and your documentaries, your Channel 4s. Like, there's a lot of great interviews. I love broadcast for that reason, because you can actually see like an interview taking place. You know what I mean? It's the same as how you'd revise for like any exam at university. Just try and see as much evidence, if that makes sense. Like, you know, you'd get better at making films by watching films. And so you get better at journalism, like, by watching interviews, is kind of what I'd say. I also think it's quite an accessible way to get good at journalism, because, like, a lot of us don't come from, or at least a lot of us probably listening to the John Schofield Trust, probably don't come from places where, you know, like, your uncle is the editor of the FT and you can get a placement straight away. But we all have access, or hopefully we all have some form of access to the internet, and we can go on social media or BBC Sounds, or, you know, other options are available, and find journalists, you know, doing their craft. Read books by journos. That's also something I love it. Like, the reporters of The Big Issue are some of the best in the game. Well, one of the senior reporters always has like a stack of books on his desk. He gave me a great recommendation recently. It was How to Interview, and I wish I could give you the author's name, but it's completely escaped me. But look for those kind of books, you know, like, treat journalism like, as I said, like a degree, you know, if you don't have a degree in journalism. But even if you do, when I was doing the NCTJ, you know, I was never told to read sort of fiction books by journalists. It was all kind of, you know, McNay's and stuff, which is great, but that's more on the practical side. I want to hear kind of the theory, what questions to ask, why we ask. Yeah, and of course, read my toolkit. It's purposefully short. Yeah, I designed it so that journalists could read it on the 30-minute bus ride, you know, on the way to interview a foster kid for the first time. You can find it for free online if you just search Sophia Alexandra Hall Toolkit. You'll find it. And as we've said throughout this podcast, you know, it can be applied to any community that's been historically underreported on, not just care experienced people.
Yeah, there are loads of resources out there, and reach out to the journalists. They might not respond to you, but they might respond to you. And from lots of experienced journalists that I've spoken to, if they have the time to respond, they will, and they will want to help you. It's not an industry that they're trying to gatekeep away from you, so they will want to help you. So yeah, don't be scared to reach out as well. So you're also a part of the John Schofield Trust. Why do you think that the work that they do is important? Why did you get involved?
It's so brilliant. I remember applying and thinking I had no hope of getting a place, and I was so excited when I got the email, and I think it was like a month and a half before I found out who my mentor was. This was back in 2022 when I got matched. I'm still really great friends with my mentor. My mentor is Katie Razzle. She's coming to my wedding in 2026.
Oh, stop. Yeah. That's so nice.
She's absolutely amazing. And what's really special for me is growing up, I didn't see that care experience representation in the media. But who I did see was Katie Razzle on Newsnight doing all these amazing pieces into my community. And so to go up from watching someone on the screen to being matched with someone who has such an in-depth knowledge of my community was so special. And yeah, she's been there through like every decision. She was with me when I was applying to the big issue. She was with me when I was applying for the Churchill Fellowship. She was with me when I was going for the TEDx talk. She's been such a valuable person. Like I do not know if I'd be where I am in this industry without her. And it's not like she's doing practical stuff like helping me with a cover letter or something. It's literally just. It's having that uncle who's the editor of the FT, it's having that kind of insight and relationship. And oh my gosh, PR people get so excited when I mention her name, because she's a titan. Like I'm like just fangirling about Katie now. But it is amazing to have that kind of connections, especially when you don't come into the industry, having that. And she's introduced me to loads of people as well. I've met people at Channel 4 because of her, and yeah, just so many people. Her name opens doors, and I guess for a lot of us, we didn't have that previously.
Hi, this is a quick pause from the episode just to say that the John Schofield Trust is a charity, and if you want to support the work that we do and help the next generation of journalists break through, then you can head to www.johnscofieldtrust.org.uk/donate. Thank you, and let's get back to the episode. Just want to end on another quote from your TED Talk. I feel like I'm fangirling over the TED Talk now, because there's just such a good mic drop ending to this TED Talk, and we have to say it here as well, which is the question isn't what makes you newsworthy, but what makes the newsworthy of you, which is just so brilliant. What would you like journalists listening to take away from that idea, sort of going forward?
Something the reason that's kind of mic drop moment is because the talk itself is called What Makes a Life Newsworthy. And I think in the newsroom, we hear this all the time, we go, what makes this story newsworthy? And we have such this analytical approach to things. It's like, will this get clicked on? Is this top of the news agenda right now? But we don't often put ourselves in the headspace of wow, we are really worthy. This is incredible. I can't believe we get to hear these people's stories. I can't believe we're trusted with these stories. And I think if we can just have more of that perspective as well, when we're rushing about the day, not having a lunch break, because we've got to file something, just keep that in the back of your mind. What an incredible job we have. At some point, I think this career was for all of us just something that was so far away and so out of reach. And so to think, how lucky are we? We get to be trusted with these stories. We get to tell these stories. We get to maybe change the world a little bit with what we do every day.
That's a great message to leave it on. And I think, if everybody adopts that, then your stories get better. You become a better journalist. So yeah, if you haven't watched the TED Talk, I would recommend it. We'll put it in the link in the description of this episode. And yeah, tune in next time to the John Schofield Trust podcast. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in to the John Schofield Trust podcast. For more episodes, make sure to follow us. Or if you want to know more about the Trust, head to www.johnscofieldtrust.org.uk and follow us on Instagram at John Schofield Trust. See you next time.